You don't belong in this community, ape. Those were the words I heard as I pushed through the glass door of Rosie's Diner on that cold Tuesday morning in November. Words that cut through the breakfast chatter, the clinking of silverware, the hiss of the griddle behind the counter. But it wasn't the words that stopped me in my tracks. It was what I saw next. A man in a black vest, fake HOA enforcement patches poorly stitched on both shoulders, had his hand wrapped around my mother's jaw. Not just touching her, gripping her. His thick fingers pressed into her cheeks, forcing her face upward, making her look at him while he humiliated her in front of a room full of strangers. Her back was pressed hard into the cracked vinyl booth. One hand was frozen halfway off the table, trembling. Her coffee cup had tipped over, brown liquid spreading across the formica surface in a slow, steady stream. She wasn't fighting him. She wasn't yelling. She was just stunned. Her eyes were wide. Her breath was shallow, coming in short, panicked gasps. She was trying to understand how a stranger, someone she'd never invited into her space, into her life, thought he had the right to put his hands on her. And he was talking while he did it. His voice was loud enough for the entire diner to hear, loud enough to make sure everyone knew what he thought of her. He called her an ape. He said she didn't belong. He said people like her, and he emphasized those words, people like her, were ruining communities, dragging down property values, making the neighborhood unsafe, unclean. The diner had gone quiet in that special, terrible way it does when everyone is watching something horrible unfold and hoping someone else will step in. That frozen silence where forks stop moving, conversations die mid-sentence, and everyone pretends they're not watching while they absolutely are. That someone was me. I had just come home from deployment. 6 months in the desert. 6 months of sand, heat, missions that blurred together, and the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones and doesn't leave. I'd taken a red-eye back to the States, caught a bus from the airport, and walked the last 2 miles to town because I wanted to surprise my mom. I knew her routine. Every Tuesday morning, 7:30 a.m., she'd be at Rosie's Diner. Same booth, same order. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, coffee black. I'd planned to walk in, slide into the seat across from her, and watch her face light up when she realized I was home. Instead, I walked in and saw a stranger's hand on her face. That image burned itself into my head before I could even process what I was seeing. It's still there now, years later. I can close my eyes and see every detail. The way his knuckles pressed into her skin. The way her fingers hovered uselessly in the air. The way her coffee dripped onto the floor. Before we go any further, I want you to do something for me. Comment below which country you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. Because what happened that day, what I did, what that man did, what the system did afterward, matters everywhere. Not just in my town, not just in my country. Everywhere people think they can abuse power because they wear a vest or carry a clipboard or live in the right neighborhood. Now, to understand why a man wearing a fake HOA vest thought he could assault my mother in public, in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, you need the backstory. You need to understand who my mother is, who that man was, and how things had gotten to this point. My mom has lived in that town her entire life. 63 years in the same house, same routines, same neighbors. Or at least, she used to have the same neighbors before everything changed. She worked 2 jobs for decades. During the day, she was a cafeteria supervisor at the elementary school. At night, she cleaned offices downtown. She paid her bills on time, every time. She kept her head down, never asked anyone for favors, never caused trouble. She belonged in that town long before the HOA ever existed. She belonged there when it was still just a neighborhood,
back when people knew each other's names and looked out for each other's kids. But things change. Towns grow. Money moves in. And sometimes the people who've been there all along suddenly don't fit the new image.
The problem started about 2 years ago, when the neighborhood got what the developers called upgraded. New housing developments went up on the east side, big cookie-cutter homes with 3-car garages and identical lawns. New people moved in, younger, wealthier, whiter. And with them came new rules. The Homeowners Association was formed. At first it seemed harmless, standard stuff, keeping lawns mowed, limiting noise after 10 p.m., that sort of thing. But then they elected a president, a woman named Karen, who decided the community needed to look a certain way. Clean, uniform, quiet, profitable. People like my mother, older, working class, black, didn't fit the image she was selling to prospective buyers. The complaints started small. Porch decorations. My mom had a bench on her front porch, worn wood, comfortable, been there for 20 years. Suddenly it was non-conforming outdoor furniture. Then it was her car, a 2004 sedan, paid off, runs fine. They said it was an eyesore, suggested she park it in the garage or on the street. Never mind that she'd been parking in her own driveway since before any of them lived there. Then it was the way she dressed when she went to the store. Too casual, not appropriate for the neighborhood's image. None of it ever violated actual bylaws. None of it was enforceable. But that didn't matter. The point wasn't rules. The point was pressure. Karen made it clear in HOA meetings. I read the minutes later, after everything went down. She'd say things like, some residents are no longer aligned with our community vision. She'd suggest voluntary relocation programs. She'd hint that certain people would be happier somewhere else. She never said my mother's name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew who she meant. My mom ignored it at first. She'd lived through worse, grown up in the South in the 60s, dealt with real racism, real threats. An uptight HOA president with a clipboard didn't scare her. But Karen wasn't working alone. That's when they sent the muscle. Fake enforcement officers. Men, always men, in black vests with official-looking patches. Radios clipped to their shoulders that probably didn't even work. Big attitudes, bigger egos. They'd show up at people's doors, clipboard in hand, reciting violations that didn't exist, threatening fines, threatening liens, threatening legal action they had no authority to take. Most people caved, paid the fake fines, made the changes, moved away. But not my mom. One of these fake cops took a particular interest in her, always showing up when she was alone, always talking down to her, always reminding her she was on thin ice, always implying that things could get worse if she didn't cooperate. I was overseas when most of this happened. I only knew pieces. She'd mention it in emails, brief, downplaying it. HOA stuff, she'd write. Nothing I can't handle. She didn't want to worry me, didn't want me distracted while I was deployed. She said she could handle herself. And she shouldn't have had to. She shouldn't have had to handle any of it. When I walked into that diner and saw his hand on her face, every piece of that history snapped into focus. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't even just about HOA rules or neighborhood disputes. This was exactly where their harassment had been leading. This was the logical endpoint of months of intimidation, threats, and racism dressed up in bureaucratic language. This was a man who thought he had power, putting his hands on a woman he thought was powerless. The fake HOA cop finally noticed me standing there in the doorway. He looked up, still holding my mother's jaw, and opened his mouth to say something. He never got the chance. Because in that moment, he wasn't dealing with a quiet old woman anymore. He was dealing with her son. And I had just come home from 6 months of doing things I can't talk about in places I'm not supposed to mention. I stepped between them, not rushed, not wild, controlled. My presence alone made him loosen his grip, just a little, like his brain finally caught up to the fact that someone else had entered the moment. My mother's jaw slipped free. She recoiled, shaking hands clutching the edge of the table like it was the only solid thing left in the room. The fake HOA cop straightened up and turned toward me, chest puffed out, rehearsed authority snapping into place. "You need to back up," he said. His voice had that fake command tone, the kind men use when they're used to people listening but aren't actually trained in anything. "This woman stole property from the diner," he said. A lie, sloppy, desperate. "She took utensils," he added quickly, gesturing vaguely toward the table. "That's theft. HOA enforcement has the right to—" He didn't get to finish the sentence. My fist landed on his jaw. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't flashy. It was clean, heavy, and final. The kind of punch that doesn't make noise so much as it makes reality rearrange itself. His mouth snapped shut mid-word, teeth clicking hard, head whipping sideways as his feet stumbled to catch up with what his skull had just learned. He staggered back into a table, plates shattered, someone screamed. I stepped in again. "You don't touch her," I said quietly. To recover, tried to square up, tried to lift his hands like he still had options. He swung wide and angry, all ego and no control, the kind of punch someone throws when they've never actually been in a real fight. I slipped it without thinking, muscle memory. 6 months of close-quarters combat training and real-world application will do that. I drove my elbow into his ribs, hard. I felt something give, not just muscle, something deeper, bone probably. He gasped, the sound ugly and wet, and folded forward. I didn't stop. I grabbed the front of his vest and slammed him down onto the floor between the booths. His head bounced once, hard. The fake radio on his shoulder skittered away, crackling useless noise across the tiles. I hooked his arm and twisted, pinning it behind his back. Joint manipulation, standard control technique. He screamed now, real fear, real pain. And I drove a knee into his side, once, twice, each hit knocking the air out of him in sharp bursts until he could barely breathe. "You assaulted my mother," I said, leaning close enough for him to hear me clearly over the chaos. "In public, in front of witnesses." He tried to say something. It came out as a whimper. I stood, hauled him up just long enough to put him back down, hard, face first this time. His body went slack, his head lolled to the side, eyes unfocused, jaw already swelling where the first punch had landed. He didn't get back up. The diner was frozen. People stood with phones raised, hands over mouths, shock written across every face. Coffee dripped onto the floor. Someone had called 911. I could hear the dispatcher's voice crackling from a nearby table. Sirens in the distance, faint but growing. I turned back to my mother. She was crying now, quietly, shoulders shaking. I knelt in front of her and took her hands, grounding her, checking her face where he'd grabbed her. Already I could see the red marks forming, fingerprints pressed into her brown skin. "I'm here," I said. "I've got you." She nodded, still stunned, still trying to process what had just happened. Behind me, the fake HOA cop didn't move. By the time the sirens cut through the silence and red and blue lights washed across the diner windows, the story was already written, on camera, on faces, on the man unconscious on the floor. 2 cruisers slid to a stop outside, lights flashing against the windows, red and blue washing over frozen faces and spilled coffee. Officers came in with hands up, voices firm, scanning the room, taking in the scene in seconds. The unconscious man on the floor in an HOA vest, broken plates, shaken patrons, my mother still trembling in the booth. I stood up slowly and raised my hands before anyone asked. "I'm the one who called," I said. "He assaulted my mother." An officer nodded and moved past me to secure the man on the floor. Another crouched to check his pulse. He groaned, barely, jaw already swelling to the size of a fist. Paramedics were called in immediately. The questions started, but they didn't take long. The diner manager pointed to the ceiling. "We've got cameras," he said. "Multiple angles. Audio." 3 different customers stepped forward without being prompted. One had recorded the entire thing on her phone, starting with the slap, the slurs, the grip on my mother's face. Another had caught the aftermath. A third had video of him bragging earlier, pacing the aisle, talking about cleaning up the neighborhood, making it clear to anyone watching that this wasn't his first time harassing people. The officers asked for my ID. I handed it over. One of them paused, glanced at it, looked back at me, measured, respectful. "Sir," he said quietly, handing it back, "thank you for your service. Stay put." They separated my mother and me, gently. A female officer sat with her, wrapped a jacket around her shoulders, and listened as she told her side through tears. When the officer asked about prior contact, my mom hesitated. Then she pulled out her phone. Text messages, emails, photos of notices taped to her door. Messages from the HOA president, Karen, that were impossible to misunderstand. "You don't fit our community. We're tired of your kind dragging property values down. Apes like you belong somewhere else. Leave now, and this all goes away." There were fake fines, too, dozens of them, each one threatening liens, eviction, legal action. None of them valid, all of them meant to scare her into leaving. The officers' expressions hardened as they scrolled.
The problem started about 2 years ago, when the neighborhood got what the developers called upgraded. New housing developments went up on the east side, big cookie-cutter homes with 3-car garages and identical lawns. New people moved in, younger, wealthier, whiter. And with them came new rules. The Homeowners Association was formed. At first it seemed harmless, standard stuff, keeping lawns mowed, limiting noise after 10 p.m., that sort of thing. But then they elected a president, a woman named Karen, who decided the community needed to look a certain way. Clean, uniform, quiet, profitable. People like my mother, older, working class, black, didn't fit the image she was selling to prospective buyers. The complaints started small. Porch decorations. My mom had a bench on her front porch, worn wood, comfortable, been there for 20 years. Suddenly it was non-conforming outdoor furniture. Then it was her car, a 2004 sedan, paid off, runs fine. They said it was an eyesore, suggested she park it in the garage or on the street. Never mind that she'd been parking in her own driveway since before any of them lived there. Then it was the way she dressed when she went to the store. Too casual, not appropriate for the neighborhood's image. None of it ever violated actual bylaws. None of it was enforceable. But that didn't matter. The point wasn't rules. The point was pressure. Karen made it clear in HOA meetings. I read the minutes later, after everything went down. She'd say things like, "Some residents are no longer aligned with our community vision." She'd suggest voluntary relocation programs. She'd hint that certain people would be happier somewhere else. She never said my mother's name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew who she meant. My mom ignored it at first. She'd lived through worse, grown up in the South in the 60s, dealt with real racism, real threats. An uptight HOA president with a clipboard didn't scare her. But Karen wasn't working alone. That's when they sent the muscle. Fake enforcement officers. Men, always men, in black vests with official-looking patches. Radios clipped to their shoulders that probably didn't even work. Big attitudes, bigger egos. They'd show up at people's doors, clipboard in hand, reciting violations that didn't exist, threatening fines, threatening liens, threatening legal action they had no authority to take. Most people caved, paid the fake fines, made the changes, moved away. But not my mom. One of these fake cops took a particular interest in her, always showing up when she was alone, always talking down to her,
always reminding her she was on thin ice, always implying that things could get worse if she didn't cooperate. I was overseas when most of this happened. I only knew pieces. She'd mention it in emails, brief, downplaying it. HOA stuff, she'd write. Nothing I can't handle. She didn't want to worry me, didn't want me distracted while I was deployed. She said she could handle herself, and she shouldn't have had to. She shouldn't have had to handle any of it.
Let me tell you more about my mother, because understanding who she is makes understanding what happened and why it mattered so much clearer. She was born in 1961 in that same house she still lives in today. Her parents bought it in 1959, one of the first black families to own property in that neighborhood. Back then, it wasn't easy. They faced threats, vandalism, neighbors who wouldn't speak to them, banks that tried to deny them loans even after they'd been approved. But they stayed. They raised 4 children in that house. My mother was the youngest. She watched her father work double shifts at the factory, watched her mother clean houses for white families who treated her like she was invisible. She learned what it meant to belong somewhere even when people told you that you didn't. She graduated high school in 1979, top of her class, wanted to go to college but couldn't afford it. So she worked, first at a grocery store, then at the school, then the cleaning company. She raised me by herself after my father left when I was 3. Never complained, never made me feel like we were missing anything. She taught me to work hard, to respect people, to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. And she taught me that home isn't just a place. It's what you build, what you protect, what you refuse to let anyone take from you. Everyone in that town knew her. The kids at the elementary school called her Miss Diane. She knew their names, their allergies, which ones had trouble at home and needed an extra kind word. The people at the diner knew her order before she sat down. She volunteered at the church, organized the community garden, helped elderly neighbors with groceries. She belonged there more than anyone. And yet somehow, a woman who'd moved to town 3 years ago, who'd bought a house with family money and decided she knew better than people who'd lived there for generations, decided my mother didn't fit. Decided she had the right to force her out. Decided she could send men to intimidate, harass, and ultimately assault her. That's what made me so angry. Not just what happened in the diner, but everything that led to it.
The HOA system and how it failed. Here's something most people don't understand about HOAs. They're largely unregulated. In most states, anyone can form one. Anyone can serve on the board. There are minimal oversight requirements, no mandatory training, no real accountability unless someone sues, which is expensive and time-consuming. This creates power vacuums that certain types of people are drawn to. People who like rules for the sake of rules. People who enjoy having authority over their neighbors. People who see themselves as protectors of property values and community standards, which often means protectors of uniformity, of sameness, of keeping out anyone who doesn't look or live like them. Karen was one of these people. She ran for HOA president on a platform of neighborhood revitalization, making things cleaner, safer, more attractive to young professionals. All of which were code words. Clean meant white. Safe meant wealthy. Young professionals meant pushing out working-class families and elderly residents who'd been there for decades. She never said it explicitly. She didn't have to. The policies she pushed made it clear. She started with fines for minor violations, lawn care, paint colors, decorations. Then she implemented stricter guest policies, parking restrictions, noise ordinances that were selectively enforced. She hired compliance officers, unlicensed, untrained men who drove around in trucks with magnetic HOA signs, writing up violations and delivering threatening notices. My mother was written up 17 times in 6 months. 17. For things like recycling bin left out too long, car parked improperly in her own driveway, garden gnome deemed aesthetically inconsistent. Each violation came with a fine: $50, $100, $200, all fake, all legally unenforceable. But my mother didn't know that. Most people don't. They see official-looking paperwork and assume it's legitimate. They pay because they're scared, because they don't want trouble, because fighting back seems harder than giving in. My mother didn't pay, and that's when things escalated. The fake enforcement officer's background. The man who assaulted my mother had a name: Derek Hutchins, 42 years old, high school diploma, no college, no military service, no law enforcement training of any kind. He worked private security for a few years, shopping malls, parking lots, that kind of thing. Got fired twice, once for excessive force, once for theft. He floated between jobs: construction, warehouse work, Uber driver for a while. He was exactly the kind of person who's drawn to fake authority. A man who felt powerless in his own life, overlooked, undervalued. A man who'd never accomplished much, but desperately wanted to feel important. Putting on a vest with official-looking patches gave him that. Driving around in a truck with HOA magnets gave him that. Having a clipboard and the ability to write up violations gave him that. Karen hired him through a friend. No background check, no interview, no written contract. Just, we need someone to enforce compliance. Can you do that? And he said yes, because of course he did. For the first time in his life, he had power over people. He could knock on doors and watch people nervous, make demands and see them comply, threaten consequences and believe he could follow through. He started with warnings, then fines, then verbal confrontations. Other residents complained about him, said he was aggressive, intimidating. One woman said he'd followed her to her car and stood too close, invading her space while he lectured her about her mailbox placement. Karen dismissed the complaints, said people were being too sensitive, said Derek was just doing his job. She encouraged him to be more aggressive. Don't let them push back, she told him in a text message investigators later recovered. You have authority, use it. Derek fixated on my mother. Maybe because she didn't back down. Maybe because she reminded him of someone. Maybe because Karen had made it clear she wanted my mother gone and he saw an opportunity to prove himself. He showed up at her house 6 times in 2 weeks. Each time he was more aggressive, more threatening, standing closer, raising his voice, making it clear that he wasn't just there to deliver notices, he was there to intimidate. The last time he showed up before the diner incident, he told her, people like you need to learn their place. My mother told him to leave her property. He smiled and said, I'll see you around. 3 days later, he saw her at the diner, and he decided to teach her that lesson. The legal aftermath and trial. The trial took 8 months to reach court. Derek's lawyer tried every angle. Self-defense, laughable given the video evidence, misunderstanding, impossible when his words were recorded, mental health issues unsupported by any documentation. The prosecution had everything. Video from multiple angles showing the assault, the slurs, the grip on my mother's face. Witness testimony from 15 people who were in the diner. My mother's phone records showing months of harassment. Text messages between Derek and Karen coordinating the campaign against my mother. I testified, explained what I saw when I walked in, described my response, acknowledged every punch, every hit, every moment I'd put him on the ground. The prosecutor asked, "Do you regret your actions?" I looked at my mother sitting in the gallery, looked at Derek sitting at the defense table with his jaw wired shut. "No," I said. "I'd do it again." My mother testified. She cried on the stand, described months of fear, of harassment, of feeling unsafe in her own neighborhood, her own town. She described the moment Derek grabbed her face. "I thought he was going to hit me," she said. "I thought no one would stop him. And then I saw my son." The jury was out for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Derek Hutchins, 15 years in state prison. Mandatory anger management. Permanent ban from any security or enforcement work. Criminal record that would follow him forever. Karen faced a separate trial. Also guilty. 8 years in prison. $25,000 in fines. Lifetime ban from serving on any HOA board. Civil judgment she'll be paying off for the rest of her life. But the legal consequences extended beyond just Derek and Karen. The HOA was dissolved, assets liquidated, remaining funds distributed to residents who'd been fined or forced to make expensive compliance changes. Class action lawsuits followed. Victims of the HOA's harassment, 43 in total, received settlements. The case set precedent in our state, led to new legislation requiring HOA oversight, mandatory training for board members, and clearer definitions of enforcement authority. One incident, one terrible, violent moment, but it changed things.
Community healing and personal reflection. The months after the trial were strange. My mother became something of a local hero. People stopped her in the grocery store to thank her, to apologize, to tell their own stories of HOA harassment. The diner, Rosie's, held a fundraiser, raised $12,000, gave it all to my mom to cover legal fees and lost wages from missing work during the trial. She cried when they presented the check, not because of the money, because people showed up. I struggled with what I'd done. Not morally, I never doubted that I'd made the right choice, but I'd spent 6 months training to protect people, to be disciplined, to use force only when absolutely necessary. And then I came home and immediately used that training on a civilian. I talked to my unit's chaplain about it, talked to other veterans who'd faced similar situations, talked to a therapist. Eventually, I made peace with it. I protected my mother. I stopped an assault in progress. I used the skills I had to intervene in a situation where someone needed help. That's not something to regret. What happened that day taught me something important about authority, real and fake. Real authority comes from legitimacy, from training, accountability, oversight, from serving others, not controlling them. Fake authority is just control. It's people with clipboards and vests and titles who think they can bully others into compliance. And fake authority only works when good people stay quiet. The neighborhood changed after the HOA dissolved. Some of the newer residents moved away. Couldn't handle living somewhere without strict rules, I guess. But others stayed, got to know their neighbors, actually talked to people like my mother instead of just sending complaints through an HOA board. The community garden my mom had helped start years ago expanded. Block parties came back. Kids played in the streets again. It started to feel like a neighborhood again instead of a development. My mother still goes to that diner every Tuesday morning. Same booth, same order.
I visit her whenever I can. Sometimes I'm there on Tuesdays, and I slide into that booth across from her. We don't always talk about what happened. Most of the time, we just talk about normal things. Her garden, my life, the neighbors, what's happening at the school. But sometimes, when the diner gets quiet, when the morning light comes through the window just right, she'll look at me with this expression I can't quite describe. Gratitude mixed with something deeper. Pride, maybe, or relief. "You came home at exactly the right time," she told me once. I shook my head. I should have come home sooner, should have known what was happening. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You were exactly where you needed to be, and when I needed you most, you were there." I think about that a lot. Timing, chance, the way life pivots on single moments. If I'd taken a different flight, arrived a day later, stopped somewhere else first, would anyone have intervened? Would the diner full of witnesses have stayed frozen hoping someone else would step in? Or would my mother have been alone with a man who felt entitled to put his hands on her in a room full of people too afraid or too uncomfortable to help?
I don't know the answer. But I know this. Evil doesn't usually look like monsters. It looks like ordinary people in official vests. It sounds like policy and procedure and community standards. It hides behind clipboards and paperwork and the assumption that if something looks official, it must be legitimate. And that's what I want you to understand, whoever you are, wherever you're watching this from. Authority has to be questioned. Rules have to be examined. Just because someone has a title or a uniform or a badge doesn't mean they have the right to harm you. Real authority serves people. Fake authority controls them. Real authority welcomes accountability. Fake authority hides from it. Real authority makes communities stronger. Fake authority makes them smaller, meaner, more divided. If you see something like what happened to my mother happening in your community, speak up. Document it, record it, report it. Stand with the person being targeted. Don't assume someone else will step in. Don't convince yourself it's not your business. Don't tell yourself that you're too busy or it's too complicated or you don't want to get involved. Because silence is how people like Derek and Karen operate. Silence is how they get away with it for months, years, sometimes decades. They count on people looking away. Don't look away. The story didn't end with the trial. In some ways, that's when it really began. Local news became national news. National news became viral social media content. My mother was interviewed by 3 major networks. Advocacy groups focused on HOA reform reached out. Legal scholars wrote papers about the case. Legislators cited it when proposing new oversight laws. What started as one man assaulting one woman in one diner became a referendum on power, accountability, and who gets to decide who belongs in a community. People from across the country sent letters to my mother, thanking her, sharing their own stories, telling her she gave them courage to fight back against their own HOAs, their own harassment, their own situations where someone with fake authority tried to push them around. She keeps those letters in a box in her living room. Sometimes she reads them when she needs reminding that what she went through mattered. Let me tell you what happened to some of the other people involved, because this story has more characters than just Derek, Karen, my mother, and me. The diner manager, his name was Frank, testified at the trial. He was in his 60s, had run Rosie's Diner for 37 years. He'd watched my mother come in every Tuesday morning for most of that time. After the trial, reporters asked him why he didn't intervene when Derek grabbed my mother. He broke down, said he was ashamed, said he'd reached for the phone to call 911 but froze, said he'd never forgive himself for those seconds of hesitation. I don't blame Frank. Fear does that to people, freezes them, makes them doubt their own instincts. And Derek looked official. He had the vest, the radio, the attitude. Frank later said he thought maybe Derek actually was some kind of law enforcement, and if he intervened, he'd be interfering with official business. That's how the illusion of authority works. It makes people second-guess what they're seeing with their own eyes. Frank put up a sign behind the counter after everything settled down. It's still there today. If you see something wrong, speak up. This is a safe space for everyone. Small thing, but it matters. The woman who recorded the video on her phone, her name was Patricia, became an advocate for bystander intervention training. She'd been terrified in the moment, hands shaking as she recorded, but she did it anyway because she knew documentation would matter. She now travels to community centers and churches, giving presentations on how to safely document incidents, when to intervene, when to call the authorities, how to be an active bystander instead of a passive witness. She called my mother before her first presentation, asked for permission to tell the story. My mother gave her blessing. If my pain can help someone else, then it wasn't wasted. The legislative changes took longer. They always do. But within a year, our state passed the Homeowners Association Accountability Act. required background checks for anyone in enforcement role, mandatory training, oversight committees with resident representation, clear appeals processes for violations, limits on fines, penalties for HOAs that engage in discriminatory practices. It wasn't perfect, no law ever is, but it was a start. 5 other states have since passed similar legislation, using our state's law as a model. Congressmen representatives have proposed federal guidelines, though those are still working through committees. Change is slow, but it's happening. The other HOA board members, there were 6 in total, all resigned. Some faced civil suits from residents. One lost his job when his employer saw the news coverage and realized he'd been part of an organization that systematically harassed and discriminated against residents. A few apologized publicly, said they didn't know how bad it had gotten, said Karen had controlled the information they received, said they should have paid more attention. I don't know if those apologies were sincere or strategic, but I know that ignorance isn't innocence. When you're part of a system that harms people, you have a responsibility to pay attention to what that system is doing. They didn't, and people suffered because of it.